Hey, listeners, welcome to the Apolitical podcast where we challenge your everyday notions.
This is Magnus.
And I'm Nate.
And today we'll be talking about the Republican campaign strategy, the highest paid kicker in the NFL, and the now infamous Elon Musk glaze session.
So today I just wanted to start off by talking about a lot of the contradictions within conservatives as the Republican campaign slugs on.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems as though a lot of their momentum has been stalled in a lot of ways, especially after the J.D. Vance pick. I think in a lot of ways that was a misstep.
Yeah, I mean, so there was the J.D. Vance pick, and that wasn't doing him any favors. And then obviously Kamala Harris taking over the campaign, which I don't think many people saw coming. I think a lot of us were bought into this idea that it was going to be Biden.
I certainly thought that Biden was going to be a stubborn old man and just be like, absolutely not. I don't care who tells me to step down. You know, I'm going to run this campaign into the ground if I need to.
And it's funny because all this loss of momentum, it's more than just a shift towards the Democrats now, right? Because we're looking at things like Trump was attempted to be assassinated weeks ago, and it's not even a mainstay of political discussion right now.
It is interesting how you would, like, especially Trump has in his recent interviews and stuff, public appearances, especially even just the Elon Musk recent space, has really tried to make it a narrative. But as you're pointing out, it's really not catching on.
It's nobody cares about it, I think, and I don't want to sound blasé in that. I think I personally wouldn't go as far to say it was horrible, but it's probably something that needed a little more attention.
In a way, I think I'm not super familiar with this, but I think him not having like a mortal wound, I think definitely kind of contributes to it. And as I was saying, he was trying to already 30 seconds after he gets shot, he's already trying to make it picturesque. And in a lot of ways, I think that came off as inauthentic. Like, it was hard to give him sympathy.
Right, to kind of turn it into something as it's happening.
Yeah, and I think it's really an interesting point because in a lot of ways, the things that they've tried, like the right wing has tried to meme into existence, into cultural relativity, I think in a lot of ways that's been successful, whereas I think the timing of Biden dropping out kind of extinguished, that flame that was starting to kindle.
Well, and yeah, so a lot of the talking points that existed while Biden was still in the race, I think were a little more salient, whereas now the attack points they're going off on, they just don't make sense, right? We went from talking about Biden as, incompetent and Sleepy Joe, and I think there's a little bit of merit there. I don't think those attacks were super authentic. I don't think they were based completely in reality, but I think we all saw those moments during the debate. We all saw it during his presidential address, where he said Vice President Trump, where he said President Putin of Ukraine
For Zelensky.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't think he actually believed in those specific lines. I think they literally were just gaffes. But that was the picture that was being painted of him somewhat successfully, which is, ultimately why he stepped down. Whereas now the attacks we're looking at is distorting Kamala's name. Kamala blah.
Yeah, or even just the retort of, for the first time in a long time, like as far as I've been paying attention to electoral politics, is this seems like one of the first times that Republicans are playing on the liberal field where it's, they are responding to, the weird accusations by just saying, well, actually, no, wait a minute, they're weird.
Well, and I think that's a great segue into these campaigning contradictions. It's Tim Walz, right? We kind of started with the whole weird thing. He said it on air. It caught on like wildfire. And now Republicans just can't argue against it. All they can say is like, no, you're weird, which is, grade school.
Well, and I think it's really to go back to like the assassination and the memification of that as well, but like as well as like the couch memes and all that sort of stuff. The couch memes and the JD Vance memes, I feel like give off of an air of authenticity where there's actually people want to share these things, people want to create these memes, whereas the things that I saw being shared around Trump's assassination were mostly within MAGA realm. People outside of it, weren't sharing, the picture of him, with his fist up.
Well, and with the JD Vance couch thing, I think it's important to understand like how this shows the disconnection Republicans have with the people they're talking to, because most people don't believe that JD Vance is having sex with couches, right? But it's funny and it's a great meme, and it's just great to rag on it because it bothers him so much, right?
Well, and it's really interesting too because that's another example of how they're trying to counter message on our field, where they're like, I don't know if you've seen, but like I think Donald Trump Jr. has posted things talking about Tim Walz and horse semen.
Oh yeah, I saw it. It made no sense.
Yeah, and it's not even. It doesn't even. I don't think it hits. It doesn't strike that chord within.
It's inorganic.
Yeah, and I don't think it has actually staying power. Whereas, as we've seen with the JD Vance memes, every time he opens his mouth, we can be reminded, oh, this motherfucker's weird.
And it's an instant classic. Like, this is a thing that's going to follow him for the rest of his political career now.
And I don't know if you've seen this stuff on Twitter, but have you seen any of the stuff with him and drag? I haven't independently verified that. But the fact is that because he's such a flip-flopper, even MAGA people are like, this dude's a flip-flopper.
Yep.
I think it's believable. Even if it's not, a valid picture, that message tracks so much more with a JD Vance than a Vivek, Ron DeSantis.
And forget, Tim Walz.
Yeah.
I think he's had an incredibly consistent record as a politician, and as a human being, honestly.
Yeah, it seems as though it's not just he's not the typical Democrat that, hey, in 2014 I was in favor of legalizing gay marriage, for example. He had the Gay Straight Alliance in his high school in the 90s and stuff. And I think
he's if you look at his history, like, he's been ahead of the curve.
And a great way to think about that too is I think maybe the Democratic Party in general has been delayed on this, but he is ahead of the Democratic Party curve of he's saying absolutely not to means testing. Why not have universal programs that benefit everyone and are a lot harder to gut and a lot harder to campaign against?
Yeah, and so I think with Kamala and with Tim Walz, I think we end up in this situation where I think Republicans don't know how to create an attack vector. One of the things I want to talk about today was the AI.
Right, and how I think that's a great example of just projection, because as you and I were talking about off air, there's a proliferation of MAGA content that is AI, especially featuring Trump, and now the accusation is everything you see of Kamala is manufactured, and it kind of also brings back to the point of this narrative started getting built with Biden with, they were saying, oh, he has a fake Oval Office that he films in. They were already kind of being primed where, you can't believe your lying eyes, essentially.
Well, and it's funny because, the rally with the airplane, we have video footage. We have in-person testimony to it. Like, it's a thing we can verify happened at that scale. And they're actually making AI images and AI videos to show how it's fake by saying Kamala is using AI footage and AI videos. It's insane.
Well, and it kind of really encapsulate what the Republican Party has become, especially in the way that they try to campaign and through rhetoric, is there is this sort of circular logic of it's fake because there are fake videos that exist of the rally, right, even if they are the originators, the creators of that content.
And just to outline some specifics here, we in the whole MAGA thing, especially on Facebook, anybody who's online on Facebook, and I spend way too much time on Facebook, we've seen those photos where it's a truck on the freeway where cars are going 7 different directions and there's 1 million American flags on the truck, and the caption is, why don't we see more images like this? And all you see is just thousands of comments of amen, praise Jesus.
Well, and what's really interesting that I didn't even really think about until we had this conversation is how exactly that ties into the romanticization of the past. Because they would post pictures that, may have appeared in a newspaper back in the 50s, and this picturesque, sort of lifestyle. And I think that's what AI has allowed them to do is say, oh, well, this is the future.
Right.
Because they're, in a lot of ways, I wouldn't say they're the most artistic crowd where they could actually...
Or most media literate.
Absolutely. In the ways that they try to co-opt, various things that are absolutely, in a lot of ways, counter-messaging against their political ideals.
And the things they're using to prop up this AI narrative, it's, that we've seen that picture now of it's the front-facing crowd rather than, behind the crowd, of all those melting faces, which you said was made by a actual troll, right?
Yeah, as far as I know, maybe we can link it in the show notes. There was somebody that had taken credit and said, hey, I was manufacturing this to partake in, the right-wing fever dream that, hey, this rally, if it did happen, there just wasn't that many people.
Right.
And was commenting saying how shockingly easily it was to get, the right-wing influencers on Twitter specifically to reshare that because they want to believe in that narrative.
Right. And there's that video I've seen shared no less than 10 times now. It shows, quote unquote, how they did it, where it shows the video of her stepping off the plane and it shows an empty tarmac, and then all of a sudden they paste in the crowd. But even just looking at that video, it's very obvious that what they're presenting is an AI manipulation. It shows, you literally see the stairs she's walking down on, they move up as she's moving down. It doesn't make any sense visually. And if you look behind the plane, you can see people walking that aren't there during the actual rally video. And when you watch them walk, you actually see their legs phase in and out. This is somebody made an AI video to show that she was using AI, which doesn't make sense. The actual footage it's unadulterated.
Well, and I think that this really goes back to that point that you made, whether it be about the VP with Walz or even just the Kamala Walz ticket altogether. They really don't have much to run on, especially think about how much Trump has emphasized throughout all of his campaigns, rally size, how many people I can get. And I just want to point out that it's really important to show that we have pictures of the same venue, inside venues, and you can see the disparity between a packed, Kamala and Walz, event, let's say, for example, with Megan Thee Stallion.
Yep.
And then you can see the direct comparison of a Trump rally where I think in a lot of ways it is a dying movement and has been for a while. And we've seen that with how people have not attended his rallies. So,
fervently.
Yeah, fervently.
And it shows, it's insane how he then goes on to, he compares his January 6th crowd to MLK's speech. It's mindfuckery.
Well, and I have a great reference for that because, I think Trump has obsessed for a long time, as long as he's been in the political sphere, that he is a great man. He will lead a march on Washington. January 6th was his essential march on Washington. But I think that, in a lot of ways, it plays into his ego of everything has to be the biggest and the bestest because Donnie Trump says so.
Yeah, I mean, and just for more of the contradiction stuff, there's, like you said, with Megan Thee Stallion, being at the Kamala rally, and then they have, Amber Rose at the RNC?
Yeah, and I will put this in there. A lot of people are theorizing that she is positioning herself for a presidential pardon due to some crypto pump and dump schemes that Amber Rose was a part of. And we could get to... I think in future episodes we could just talk about the contradictions as well as the facade of the griftosphere of Republican sort of, even people that aren't necessarily Republican operatives, let's say, for example,
but they definitely work well in those circles when they start grifting.
Oh, absolutely. There's a reason why various Republican campaigns have reached out to, for example, the Paul brothers to be like, hey, can you spread this message to your young and impressionable audience? I think that's, they will use any celebrity that they can co-opt and is receptive to spreading their message.
And then, obviously, with the the last little contradiction is just the way they talk about Tim Walz, the attacks they've used to attack Tim Walz, like the whole stolen valor narrative, while they're running on General Bone Spurs.
Yeah, and I think that's and to discredit his service in the National Guard as if like it's not real service unless you're deployed in combat, like it doesn't even apply to JD Vance. That is an inherent contradiction where it's like, I don't remember exactly where JD Vance was deployed to, but as far as the public record shows, he was doing clerical work. He was doing paperwork, and to, try to run on this, I think what's really failing the Republicans is JD Vance is not a machismo. He does not give off an air of machismo. He's more of a Mitt Romney, sort of in line with, the deep-pocketed interests.
And when Trump isn't running against, whether it's Hillary Clinton, who had a public persona of being corrupt and being, in the pocket of the elites, or running against Biden, who did come across as like a feeble old man, I think Trump also just loses a lot of that air as well.
And as well as, like, I think one big difference between Kamala and Biden is just that she doesn't have as extensive a public record with contradictions. I think that's something that the Republican Party in general is really struggling with, not being able to highlight those contradictions that they see.
Yeah. So for the next section, I kind of want to talk about, we've talked about this quite a bit over the past couple of months, is we saw in the news that Harrison Butker is now the highest paid kicker in the NFL, in all NFL history.
Yeah, and granted, I will give him his due. He's a great kicker. He, has had the opportunity in life to practice kicking a football many a times, and I think ultimately what would be interesting to try to come to somewhat of a conclusion on is whether or not he's paid despite his public rhetoric, or is the NFL in some ways encouraging that sort of behavior, or, the NFL has encouraged a lot of not even necessarily bad behavior, but even illegal behavior. There's been people that, if you can play, there's going to be leniency there.
Yeah. But let's start off by kind of introducing some of these elements with Harrison Butker. So, we have the Benedictine commencement speech. That's probably what he's most known for right now. And that's where he spoke at the Benedictine College commencement. And he kind of just went off on a lot of bizarre talking points. He is deeply Catholic. He's involved with the Latin Mass. We will link some resources in the show notes in regards to the Latin Mass, because if you're not in the Catholic Church, it is somewhat complicated. But the easiest way to put it is, when the Vatican II happened, which was an effort to draw more people into the Catholic Church, the Latin Mass took an issue with that. They have a website that we both of us went through the Wayback Machine on, just to kind of see what that movement looked like throughout the years. And there was a point where it just kind of looked like a Net 1.0, just kind of standard fare website, just containing information on the Latin Mass, what they stand for, just kind of like a blog space essentially. And then it went down for a few years, and then all of a sudden it was back up. And the first thing you see on it is, like, it's got a high level of polish. It's got a little button right there for you to subscribe to the Latin Mass. It's got videos by Michael Knowles.
Yeah, I remember you showing me on the Wayback Machine, seeing that, Michael Knowles pops up. And granted, I've seen him throughout various media appearances, but I wasn't exactly shocked to see him there. But it was almost kind of confirming in the sense that this is a theological movement that has political roots, has political connections.
Yep.
And it's not even just necessarily to political commentators, but they absolutely have connection to political power players, whether that be, with the Supreme Court and Leonard Leo. And, I think a really interesting aspect that I would love to talk about is in the intro to Harrison Butker's Benedictine speech is the immediate attack on, like, the false Catholic Biden. This representation of him as like, Catholics cannot take, I forget what it's called, to bear the cross or to sign the cross. And that was one of the first things he says is like, how can he sign the cross as a Catholic, but, framing abortion as murder, following that up is inherently a political framing of that issue.
Right. And before he did the commencement speech for Benedictine some years ago, he did a commencement speech for Georgia Tech, which is his alma mater. And it's interesting looking at the difference between the Georgia Tech speech and the Benedictine speech. The Georgia Tech speech definitely came off as a lot more casual, a lot less polished. This was just Harrison Butker talking on a stage. There was less production. Like, this was just somebody who had a camera at the event. This wasn't actually like, this didn't have like sophisticated editing, a high definition camera. And the tone was a lot different. He was a lot rougher. There was some political stuff within his speech, but it really was just standard fare in terms of a commencement speech.
In a lot of ways, I would say that the things that he was saying during the Georgia Tech speech were not things that would be too uncommon to hear in any sort of Catholic mass. And I think in a lot of ways, the departure from the Georgia Tech speech, the bulk of the content of that, to when he went to the Benedictine school was, as we were saying, like the inherent politicalization of his rhetoric and how he sold a narrative. And in a lot of ways, I think that speech does give off a very much telling a story, opening up with the COVID lockdowns, talking about the mishandling of that, and which I find so interesting just due to the fact that so much time has passed and that's still so culturally relevant for the right.
Yeah. It's, and so his mom, she has 2 university degrees. She is a university professor.
She's
a clinical medical physicist at Emory.
And since the late 80s.
Yeah.
So for a long period of time, all of Harrison Butker's upbringing.
Yes. So it's interesting then going into the speech where, he starts off by, he attacks Biden without naming him. He makes a vague dig at Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift.
Which is so interesting because I actually had somebody argue with me online when that speech happened that, he didn't say Taylor Swift's name explicitly. It's kind of like that, a very technicality debate, bro, of like, well, just read the transcript. But if you know who he's teammates with and who his possible girlfriends could be, I think it's quite evident.
Well, I think this ties back around into media literacy, right? I think to anybody who's in tune with modern events, I think it's very clear who he's talking about. I don't think there's any blurred lines there.
Well, and I think a lot of it too is it's purposeful to try to distance, because in a lot of ways I view the attack on Taylor Swift as like a pressure campaign, and I think his speech was sort of the culmination. As far as I've seen, there's been a lot less, especially after football season, there's been a lot less pressure on Taylor Swift specifically.
Well, and it's interesting because all this happens in the aftermath of this whole narrative of Taylor Swift psyop, right?
Right, and the Super Bowl's rigged, and it's really interesting that the right will accuse the left of, you guys will ruin anything that's not inherently political. Yet they're concocting these conspiracy theories about the most popular football game to try to convince other people that, hey, let's just, in a lot of ways become very, very disengaged from the rest of the world unless it's through that conspiratorial lens.
Right. You say that conspiratorial lens, and I think that's hitting the point right there, is that I don't think they see the world outside of whatever they've been taught to see the world through. I think this is very, endemic to. Well, I don't want to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but I think it is a very salient symptom of evangelical Christianity and conservative Catholicism.
Well, and I think that would be certainly something worth to unpack on a future episode. I would love to do a series on the VP picks because obviously there has been a lot of coverage of them. Although as the campaign continues to roll on, I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on Kamala and Trump.
Right. So as far as like the speech itself, yeah. So we're covering Biden, Taylor Swift. He makes a dig at that the anti-Semitism bill, so-called anti-Semitism bill.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. That was like one of the biggest. That as well as the narrative of women are fulfilled in the kitchen,
Yes.
barefoot, pregnant all the time. I remember that being the one big thing was I think he explicitly said something along the lines of, "We won't be able to say who killed Jesus," and it has been a long-standing anti-Semitic thing where people have come to the conclusion that it is not Nero's fault for the death of Jesus and Jesus' persecution, but it is actually the Pharisees, which they one-to-one have an analogy to modern-day Jews, which is misleading at best.
At best, yeah. I would definitely not give it that much charity myself.
No, certainly not. As I was looking into the Harrison Butker background, as we were saying, like, this is manufactured. This man has been politically involved to various degrees, whether it be the former Georgia Tech speech, him meeting up with Mark McCloskey, who ran for Missouri senator, who was the man who infamously, him and his wife pointed guns at BLM protesters in St. Louis, I believe. So this is a man that has a lot of political through lines in his past, especially in his recent past.
Well, I think this gets at the heart of the whole apolitical thing and why I just have this disdain for people who say they're apolitical or people who say, well, this is not political. His entire speech is intensely political.
Or they're entitled to their opinion. And it's
right.
Like, well, in essence, if we're also entitled to our opinion, that allows for us to be able to critique and to
right.
say, this is a bit absurd, this isn't the way that everyone ought to live. Because, throughout that speech, he says, stay in your lane. He's talking about, amateur, basically Catholic theologians that they don't understand unless it's the, traditional Latin Mass. And it's just really ironic and really emblematic of the right wing where they say, just stay in your lane unless you have something that we like to say.
Right. He says that multiple times throughout the speech, stay in your lane. It's very interesting because, he's a kicker, right? He is not a theologian. He is not a Catholic bishop or, whatever the case may be. He kicks footballs for a living. And he's good at it, but it's very... There's something that just doesn't click when he's telling people who actually do Catholicism for a living to stay in their lane.
Well, and it's really interesting, too, because we opened with talking about him being now the highest paid kicker. And granted, he has been a very successful kicker, but in a lot of ways, he also wouldn't be as prominent if he was on a bad team.
Right.
No one would care. It's the fact that you can connect his name to Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes and Taylor Swift that I think a lot of the ways he knew, as we were pointing out, the manufactured look of the Benedictine speech made it as though it maximized its potential shareability, I think, in a lot of ways.
Well, it kind of takes us into this point where I hear the narrative that, his speech wasn't political, or Harrison Butker isn't political, or nothing he said was political. And the entire thing is political. It's a production through and through. This video reached millions of viewers. A lot of people saw this video. I think there's a certain level of ignorance that comes with saying, well, this video with this level of reach, with this level of resonance within the Republican Party, it's not political. I think that takes a very special brand of media illiteracy.
Well, and there are real world impacts of his speech, whether it be, him becoming the highest paid kicker, despite that. But also he benefited off the fact that his jersey became one of the top sellers, I think, one of the weeks after that speech was shared so widely. So it is. I think he is very emblematic of everything that's going on politically, even though people try to, as hard as they can, be like, it's just an apolitical speech. The guy's just giving his religious views, and he's just trying to suggest what would be best for families.
Well, a lot of it was a lot of the criticism online revolved around him telling women to basically be trad wives, and I think that comes with a lot of baggage. I think it exists within the context of the current discussion around trad wife, around the trad wife movement. That has been a heated discussion for almost a year now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that stuff also too, within the last year, definitely it has become much more mainstream, but in a lot of ways, something to highlight is that all right-wing movements require women to serve in them. Yep. And that is their main goal, or their main duty within those right-wing movements, is to serve the other men that are trying to accumulate political power.
They can keep saying that they just want women to have the ability to choose to be stay-at-home wives, but I think we see the results in all of our news. I mean, when we look at these women that are on TikTok that talk about the trad wife movement and then denigrate other women who actually choose to go on to be professionals, who decide to be child-free. There is a lot of stigma about being child-free, right? You're assumed to be an incomplete woman in a lot of circles if you can't, or if you decide not to have a child. We can look at other news events like I can't remember her name, but there was that one TikTok trad wife influencer that said the N-word, right? I think that highlights what kind of circle we're talking about, because we can talk all day about how political the trad wife movement is, but I think it's obvious who is championing the trad wife movement, and that is conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics.
Well, and it's really interesting that you brought her up, because she was an example that I was thinking about as well, where it's like, even if you live an existence of the trad life, living up to that ideal, and let's say, for example, you marry into an abusive relationship, even with J.D. Vance, for example, coming out and saying, maybe no-fault divorce shouldn't be a thing. And that's been a growing narrative as well. Like, along with the trad wife movement, and that's something I think we could unpack on another episode, is there's a lot of policy prescriptions that are, tied directly within to aid that trad wife movement.
Right.
And I mean, even wasn't it Vance that was saying the thing about marriages or people that don't produce children should be taxed more, a reverse child tax credit, essentially.
And I definitely, later on, I do definitely want to talk about J.D. Vance's policy. But, yeah.
It's definitely worth unpacking, and especially, I think, of the connection for him specifically is his connection to a lot of dark money interest groups, Silicon Valley, as well as a lot of the trad calf. As an adult convert Catholic, I think that is something certainly worth doing some investigation on.
And so I don't think it's enough to just say, you can't even just say it's a compelling argument to say that his speech was political. I don't think you can separate his speech from politics. I think it's there through and through. The way he talks about politicians, he talks about Joe Biden's lockdown, and it's not Joe Biden's lockdown. It's we have this, the Republicans have this weird amnesia when it comes to things that happened. It's who ultimately locked down the government. Well, it was Trump, because the COVID happened on his watch and 500,000 Americans died because he didn't do the lockdown soon enough. But then Biden is then held to account by a kicker for his response to the COVID pandemic when he did everything correctly as soon as he took over office.
Well, and I think it also ties back into the celebrity nature of it. It's like the Republican side has very slim pickings as far as prominent names that can come out and say,
They have Kevin Sorbo.
They have Kevin Sorbo. They got Rob Schneider, the great talents of yesteryear. But I think that's a lot of the reason why I view the spread of his speech as so inorganic was that it seemed, in a lot of ways, perfect timing, And they were also desperate for any prominent person to come out and say, hey, you're going to say the lines, for example. Like, I'm surprised he didn't, come out and say, Biden regime. Because that's, he was bordering on, the vocabulary of the right with just about every other talking point.
Yep. And then, it gets us into this point where, so now Harrison Butker is the highest paid kicker in NFL history. And I think, you mentioned it at the beginning, we can discuss whether he is going to be the highest paid kicker because of, his own merit and in spite of a lot of the crappy things he has now said, or whether that has contributed to his celebrity, contributed to his value in the NFL. Like you said, the sales with the jerseys, like he's a seller, right?
Yeah, like he's financially contributing to the NFL's coffers. So I could see in a lot of ways, I think there were some NFL spokespeople that had come out and said this doesn't represent the views of the NFL, but in a lot of ways, they're in a tough dynamic, and we could unpack the sports thing later, but a lot of sports leagues are under this pressure of, do we allow athletes to speak? Do we not? Do we want it to be? Because in a lot of ways, the owners want it to be separate. They want sports to be apolitical, despite them being inherently political.
I'm not convinced anytime they release a statement like that they actually care. I think largely when they denounce somebody within the NFL or specific view that's been, that's been communicated, they're always just going to play it safe. They're always going to distance themselves to whatever's been said. They're going to do whatever is going to bring the least amount of harm to their organization.
Yeah, it's definitely, I view it as similarly that it's just a PR move. Get ahead of this.
Yep.
We're going to release a statement within 6 to 12 hours after, that being shared. And I think, in a lot of ways, it does just come down to money. And it would be interesting to further look into Harrison Butker's background, whether he's given paid speeches elsewhere. Because in a lot of ways, like you and I have been really highlighting and demonstrating, is that this was a production. He was very well rehearsed. So it's hard for me to think, oh, this guy just, decided in the offseason to give this speech kind of thing.
He's a product.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to dehumanize somebody, but he is somebody off of which a lot of people can make money off of.
Well, and that's a big thing too, is he is a product of our political reality. And so it's so absurd that people are trying to absolutely separate those two and say, he could have gave this speech anywhere at any Catholic school. It's like, no, it's a very much a Western English language speech in a lot of ways, especially a U.S. focused one.
Right. I think it kind of points to this issue where, we live in a capitalistic society and everything that stems from capitalism is politics. Like, you can't, and I know we've said this, obviously this is the first episode of the podcast, but in our own discussions, we've said this a million times, like, everything is political. And especially when you're talking about money, when money's involved, like, there's politics to be had.
Well, yeah, and the way that I view it is, politics is just is one of the fundamental ways to wield power, and a lot of that is also influence, and to delude yourself or delude other people that we're not constantly inundated with influence of cultural messaging, whether it be through advertisements, whether it's the media we consume, and probably most of the time don't even understand because of that lack of media literacy. I think in a lot of ways, it goes back to a bigger topic of like recuperation under capitalism. It's like even messages that would be against capitalism's end goals can then be repackaged and resold to the people.
And it just, I look at him. Sorry. Harrison Butker is the 7th best kicker in NFL history. Yeah,
as far as for people, I think there was some parameters as far as like amount of field goals attempted. I think it was like at least 200 career attempts, as well as through the first 8 seasons, which I believe he has played. Yes, he is a top 7 or 8 kicker as far as accuracy of all time.
But, when you consider his upbringing, when you consider his background, when you consider his platforming, you can't help but ask, is he the seventh best kicker at all, right? He's in the NFL. He's been given the opportunity. He has. He is existing in a space that has been provided for him. That is also political. Are there better kickers out there than Harrison Butker that are never going to be in the NFL? That's political.
Yeah, and I think a lot of ways, like his political upbringing, a youth being, raised by, as far as I can see publicly, a devoutly Catholic upbringing, as well as, being affluent, it gives him that time to just be like, you know what? It seems like I'm pretty good at kicking this football. And what's so interesting within his speech is his disconnection from reality, because a lot of his narrative is through that conspiratorial lens that we were talking about. But also he's talking as though, everyone can just be the highest paid kicker.
Yep.
Everyone can just, afford to have their wife not work and give her that sense of fulfillment that even in his speech, he's essentially saying, I gifted her fulfillment.
Yeah.
When I chose her, when I married her. And part of me is just, it would be really interesting to see if there's any public comment from his wife.
Right.
Of she's like, yes, absolutely.
It's also interesting too, because if he weren't a kicker, he'd still be fine. That's also an aspect of this. He was always going to have a cushy life.
Yeah, or even if you think about it, even before he signed this most recent contract, the most expensive for a kicker in history, he already is in an upper echelon as far as class.
Right.
Immediately as soon as he signed his first, contract, at least as far as income, not necessarily wealth, but, as we're pointing out, he had a wealthy upbringing. And I think that's something that's really important to highlight. And I think a lot of apolitical people, and this is part of media literacy as well as what is produced by our media, class analysis is missing a ton. And I think a lot of people don't even have that self-perspective. I don't remember who it was, but did you ever see that clip of, I think it's David Beckham talking to, I think, his wife or something, and she's talking about, I had it so rough that, my dad sometimes had to drive me to school. Anyways, she's trying to make it, this sob story, and David Beckham comes in the room and is essentially like, well, what car was your dad driving? And eventually she reveals that it's, some high-class car. But in a lot of ways, I think that is, an example of a much pervasive thing amongst higher class people, where they say, my money and my power that I've accrued or inherited, that's not political. I'm pretty apolitical. And I think this ties perfectly into the Elon Musk Trump space, where it's like, we're just two billionaires just chit-chatting. This isn't political, even though it's one of the guys running for president.
It makes me think of whether it's Arrested Development or Schitt's Creek. You take high-class people and put them in a situation where they don't have access to the things they've had, and just watch how fast things deteriorate. Those
are definitely, of the two, this is a little bit tangential, but of the two, which would you recommend? Because I haven't seen either.
Schitt's Creek.
Schitt's Creek.
That's one of my favorite all-time shows. Although Arrested Development is probably more not realistic, but more coherent messaging.
Okay, fair enough. I've definitely considered Schitt's Creek watching, because it definitely appeals to me. But
yeah, so the Harrison Butker speech, I think we can both agree, is incredibly political. And anybody who is saying that it isn't political, I think they're either misinformed or they're lying.
Or in a way, another way to think about it too is apolitical sometimes can be a cover for, I agree with these politics, and I don't want to back up why I believe these politics, so therefore I can just assert, it's apolitical.
Which is, that's a very common tactic from the right, is to assert that something that is overtly political has no politics. Because then they can argue from the position of common sense, or this is just how things are, or just how things should be.
Well, and I think touching on that common sense thing, it kind of bringing it back to the AI Harris crowd thing, is I think that really played into the whole silent majority thing that's, been a decades-long thing, where it's like, even if people aren't showing up to our thing, we can just, AI generate a crowd, or, just say, we're busy because we're quote unquote taxpayers and we're working, so we can't make the rally. There's always an excuse. And, I think it just kind of lends to that whole, like, the conspiratorial mindset of and accountability as well, I think. The party of accountability is like, it's everyone else's fault.
Yes. Everyone secretly believes the thing that I believe.
And I have run across that so frequently just in online discourse where it's like, if you can't back up what you have to say, I've cornered people and they just eventually relent and say, well, what you don't really know is that the majority of people agree with me. Despite all the polling's fake. Unless it shows Trump winning, then those polls are correct.
Yep. I see everybody right now quoting the Rasmussen polls, as if Rasmussen hasn't been dropped from 538 for being overtly conservative.
Well, yeah, and it just makes it, I think it goes back to like the media literacy or people being, I think, willfully ignorant. People just want to not look into, or, Rasmussen agrees with my politics and I don't want to be viewed as, much further right than, the typical conservative. I'm more of a MAGA Republican. I don't want to view myself as that. So actually, even as Elon was saying the other day, I'm just a moderate liberal. It's the liberals that have gone crazy, folks.
Now, speaking of Elon Musk, I guess we need to talk about this elephant in the room.
And yeah, certainly the slurring elephant is definitely something that I think is timely to talk about, and I think it will always go down as somewhat a part of the 2024 election, but I don't think it will have much staying power in the election.
Do you want to tell our listeners what we're talking about, just in case anyone is still lost?
Yes, so if you're unaware, well, let me go back a little bit. So last year, Elon and some of his Silicon Valley buddies got together and said, hey, let's do a hard launch for DeSantis. And I, unfortunately, had the free time to partake in that space as well. And it had very much similar technical difficulties where, audio was getting dropped. Maybe, whoever was the guest or the host was disconnecting. And so that happened with the hard launch of the DeSantis campaign, which, obviously, Elon at the time was very on board with. And so, cut to, this year in August, the space launches, and we've got lo-fi hip-hop music that Trump is playing as the host, which I'm like, which intern is, who's got the playlist? I think he just couldn't play copyrighted music as he does at all of his rallies. So, anyways, long story short, a very long, tedious, tiresome story. Trump goes on for about 2.5 hours having a very friendly conversation with Elon Musk, to which Elon Musk is saying, I'm just trying to really couch your extremism, sir. I'm just a moderate liberal, and these are just things that make sense. We just need to protect the border. That's just a given. Even the quote-unquote Democrats agree with that. And I'll grant them that point. They do, but
I don't know if Democrats agree on it or if they've just been strong-armed into adopting that stance.
I think, yeah, that's probably a better perspective to have on it. Because in a lot of ways, the Democratic Party post-Clinton has been strong-armed in a lot of ways, and it's hopeful with the Harris-Walz campaign that hopefully they'll be able to stick up to that. But, yeah, I just think, in general, the Elon and Trump space was very conversational, and part of me is thinking it would be beneficial to have more conversations where Trump is loose. It's late at night. He's, slurring his words a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, slurring his words. It sounded like he didn't have his dentures in. I've heard comparisons between him and Daffy Duck.
I did see that. It was absolutely wild to see the live tweeting going on, even before the space was actually even functional.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely wild that they continue to be like, oh, let's add Elon's account into this, because that's what they blame on the lack of connectivity is that, oh, Elon's account's so big so that when his followership sees that the space is available, that's what's crashing it. And it's like, you guys say that you run these tests of like, oh, the servers can handle this amount. And even when they started, he was like, there's a DDoS attack, which, granted, I'm surprised Trump didn't come on immediately and was like, it was Iran.
What, are we playing League of Legends?
Yeah, for real. I mean, I'm sure, Musk probably may have been playing it in the background, just trying to, get a league rank up. But, I mean, some of his responses sure sounded like that. He was like, yep, sure, buddy, you're so right. Now, all the listeners.
I didn't watch most of this, mostly because I just couldn't bring myself to. I can only punish myself so much. But I have seen a few different clips that I wanted to talk about. The first one.
Can we pause just 1 second before you say that? Something that I have to absolutely highlight is that X, Twitter, launched a live video service a year ago. And a lot of people were wondering, okay, is this space going to be like the Ron DeSantis one where I have to mention this about the Ron DeSantis one. It eventually devolved into a Q&A where random people with Twitter Blue were like, hey, Mr. maybe future president, let's chit chat. So I was kind of expecting that. But a lot of people were expecting a video transmission because apparently there's the capabilities of it. But they couldn't even figure out just doing basically an audio call and broadcasting that in the space. They utterly failed, and then afterwards can say, oh, well, we were under attack, or the audience was just so large, in a lot of ways we didn't expect, as Trump said, millions and millions of people are listening. Or they even posted the stats afterwards where they were conflating live views with viewers, when it's like, if you know anything about analytics, a live view could be somebody clicking on the space a few times, and none of them count as, they're not unique viewers.
Right.
But it kind of lends to the whole, silent majority, everybody agrees with us.
Yep.
Everyone that's listening, they love it.
Yep. I do want to talk about a few of the specific things he said that are just, they've been media fodder. They're absolutely hilarious. And I don't think they'll have lasting power throughout the election. But I've gotten a kick out of them. First, I got to talk about the no way away thing.
Which, up until the point that you mentioned it, I hadn't really been paying attention to a lot of the mainstream media reaction to it because, unfortunately, I was there for the whole 2.5 hour, 3 hour event, glaze session, as we say,
Yep. And then, so basically, what he said was this. He said, and start quote, I said to Vladimir Putin, don't do it. You can't do it, Vladimir. If you do it, it's going to be a bad day. You cannot do it. And I told him what I do. And he said, no way. And I said, way.
Which is absolutely, it's crazy that just flew over my head at the time, because that is a perfect example of a Trumpism. Yeah. Just, I'm going to talk like, a regular guy, and this is how foreign policy works.
It's given us the revelation that world leaders talk to each other like teenage girls. Which I never knew about.
Especially with Donald Trump, I think. In a lot of ways, that's probably how the conversations go. And something that I want to highlight, just connecting it to the, the Putin thing, was something that he said to at the debate that I don't know if was public knowledge beforehand, if he had been saying this previously, but he was talking about, even in the space, like, oh, these, authoritarians, you think they're so dumb, but they're really strong and smart, and I'm not friends with them, but they respect me. Something that he said during the Biden debate was that him and Putin had discussed the invasion of Ukraine previously, which I don't know if that was public knowledge beforehand, because I was kind of like, he's just admitting like, oh yeah, me and this guy were kind of like, essentially, in a lot of ways, I would describe it as coordinating, rather than like, oh, I got me and Vlad are just real besties, so that's why he divulged this information. It was more of a coordination, like, hey, Trump, if you win a second election, just so you know, I am going to invade Ukraine. And Trump can say, well, how much is Ukraine donating to NATO? Are they paying their fair share? Are their bills up to date?
Yeah. It's insane just listening to Trump spin his wheels. The other quote I want to talk about is when he was talking about our vice president. I don't know if you saw that part.
The Time magazine.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So I've got the quote right here, and he said, in reference to Kamala Harris, he says, "She looks like the most beautiful actress ever to live. Actually, she looked very much like a great first lady, Melania. She didn't look like Camilla." He pronounced it wrong. "But of course, she's a beautiful woman, so we'll leave it at that, right?" It's just bizarre.
I think it is bizarre. I think it is a very Trump thing to say because, as he's built his, not even necessarily his political career, but even just his career in, multimedia, he has built that off of denigrating women by their looks. And I think he is at least aware enough to say he cannot attack her on that, I don't think he thinks that's a winning point. I don't think he's going to win over anybody, especially with, the J.D. Vance comments about women.
I also don't think it's going to win him any points to talk about how attractive our VP is.
It gave off very much, whenever he's describing, he described Kamala the way he describes like objects or like his rally, that, they're the most beautiful, nobody can deny it. Kamala's beautiful, but she's also beautiful like my first lady. I think he just posted,
but not like her.
Yeah, I think he just posted that as maybe an outreach to Melania, just being like, "Hey, baby, still thinking about you.
You look like Kamala.
The woman that I
sorry, Camilla.
Yeah, apparently Camila Cabello, 2024 is the thing. Apparently, that's who he thinks he's running against. But it is interesting, we were talking about how the Republican campaigns, especially Trump's campaign against Biden, as incompetent, and it doesn't really play well when he was running on Biden's the worst and he's the most incompetent, to then come out and say, well, actually, Kamala is actually much worse. Like, he's really struggling with how does it get worse than the worst?
It's interesting because he went from running against the incompetent candidate to he is now the incompetent candidate. I think everybody is really seeing, especially in the last 3 weeks, how incoherent he is, how much he slips, how much he doesn't know what he's talking about, and how easy that is to see against a younger, more well-spoken candidate.
Well, and it's really interesting that after, I don't know if the timing of this aligns perfectly, but it seems as though like post, especially RNC, but even like maybe post assassination attempt, the Republican campaign strategy has really been to try to put J.D. Vance out there, and we're seeing that, as we've discussed many a times, the home state effect of the VP is not very significant, and Vance as a VP is unique in the sense that his net favorability is negative.
Well, it's he tries to claim this whole Appalachia thing, but he's from Ohio and he's in with the tech bros, and nobody likes him. Nobody likes J.D. Vance.
Well, in with the tech bros, I think there was some reporting we may be able to link in the show notes where I believe, if not Elon Musk, certainly people connected to Elon Musk within the Silicon Valley realm were pushing for J.D. Vance.
And I definitely, like, when we talk about J.D. Vance, I definitely want to bring that up because I think it kind of highlights a lot of his weirdness.
Yeah, it would be interesting to further dissect the coalescing of especially a lot of moneyed and powered interest within the Republican Party around the J.D. Vance Trump ticket. I was considering, the other day on stream, like, who potentially could have been an alternative VP pick. And I think in a lot of ways, Vance speaks to that cultural and like the social conservatism, as well as the vague appeal of Trump's populism to a working class that they have really no interest in advocating for. Well, they'll advocate for in rhetoric alone, but then be like, hey, you know, if you're a striking worker, let's say, for example, at Tesla, you know, Trump is gleefully talking about how, you know, Elon can fire striking workers, or, you know, that should just be the norm.
Yep. Yeah, it was definitely, as you put it at the beginning, it was a Glay session.
Yeah, I think that is a perfect a way to describe it, in the sense that there was nothing. There was I will say this. I think this is worthy of adding. To the amount that Elon Musk could muster a response to Trump, the one thing that he did actually counter was Trump was saying, you know, we got to drill, baby, drill. You know, that's what we're running 2024 on.
A 2016 election slogan.
Yeah, and something that is inherently contradictory when he's also saying, like, oh, we're going to have the cleanest air and water. It's like, okay, yeah, we're going to do that through fracking. Yeah, for sure. Yep, that tracks. Anyways, Trump had said, I believe, that we should continue using fossil fuels for the next 500 to 1,000 years. Whereas Elon was trying to be like, well, sir, although we don't want to, you know, disparage the oil executives because we don't want to hate any rich people, including us.
Right.
Maybe we could, through technological advancement that I would personally benefit from and profit from, maybe we could get there in 50 to 100 years to where we have energy independence. But he kind of had to couch that all in this sort of, you know, oh, well, we don't want to villainize the oil companies. You know, they really care about us. They're just like us.
They can't hurt their donors.
No, not at all. And I think that would be an interesting aspect also to look into the J.D. Vance and Trump ticket, is what access to donors has that allowed? What doors has that opened?
Right. That
might have been closed, or maybe they were looking to send their funds maybe to RFK.
God, that deserves an episode on its too.
Oh, I would absolutely love to do an RFK Jr. episode, and I think, you know, as long as we get it out before the election, it's timely.
Yeah.
And
all right, well, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Apolitical. And remember, Harrison Butker wants you to stay in your lane.